name's Erica Mills. I run a company called Klaxon. We teach those doing good. So all of you, and then all the people joining us online, we teach you how to get noticed. I have the great good fortune to be, I think it's technically the moderator, but I'm sort of thinking of it as the conversation Sherpa and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about each of these individuals here in a minute, but for Paul Shoemaker, Jane Meseck, Eric Stowe, and then of course Beth Kanter. Before I go any further, though, I would be remiss if I did not say a great big thank you on our collective behalf to Microsoft. Thank you. It is because of Microsoft and their generosity that we are all gathered here today to talk about data transparency and impact. So Paul, when he walked in, said, "So what do you think everybody was so excited about this topic?" And I said, "I don't know. I'm hoping we'll find out. But what I do know is that we ran out of tickets pretty darn quick. So I am really proud that Klaxon, along with Splash and Tenacious Ventures, could team up to bring the live streaming so that more people could have access to what I think is going to be a really great conversation. So I want to invite Colin from Tenacious Ventures up here to explain to us kind of how the live stream is going to work.
Jump. Go and go to the next one as well. I can start with some of it as it's transitioning. But basically, you see down here, we have down at the bottom the live stream link. So I put it so it's really easy to tweet out. So if you want to grab your phones, update your Facebook, even right now, I already checked and we already have 50 people watching the live broadcast right now. So we'd love to bump that number up. So if you jump onto your Twitter or Facebook, use the hashtag Kanter SEA when you're tweeting. And the link down here, we're going to leave these up here as well, even as the panel is happening, so that you can tweet out and join the online conversation as it's occurring as well. And the one thing to use is when you do tweet out this shortened link, use the capital D and the capital T, because that's also part of the way that it recognizes it. It is case sensitive. So enjoy the show, and I'm looking forward to seeing what the panel has to say. So afterwards, you can find the information. If you go to the Eventbrite page, you'll be able to go on there and see where we post the recorded video afterwards. And also, you can follow this stream here with number Kanter SEA, and I'll even be tweeting out the links to that after the show. So thank you.
A round of applause for Colin, Tenacious Ventures, Splash. Thank you. Oh, is there a password for Wi-Fi? Yes, there is, and all is going to be revealed. What is it? Chocolate, all lowercase. Did you guys see the collection of chocolate out front? It's very impressive for those who like chocolate. Okay, so we are here to talk about data transparency and impact. I want to take a couple minutes to introduce you to each of these panelists, and here's why. Because they're going to roll their eyes and turn red and stuff, but I do not think it is an understatement or an overstatement, although I am one who is prone to hyperbole, to say that what we have in front of us are the four people who are doing some of the best and most progressive thinking on this topic anywhere on the planet. So I want to make sure that we maximize our time. Now, I also want to make sure that you actually know the breadth and depth that we have sitting up here. So I'm going to start with Paul. Paul, will you wave to the crowd, please? Paul Shoemaker. Don't look too enthusiastic about your position up there. So Paul is the Executive Director of Social Venture Partners. Social Venture Partners is a global network of individuals, really citizens, who believe that they can make their communities a better place by applying strategic solutions to very complex societal problems. He has been at the forefront of the engaged philanthropy space since the 90s. He went to Nestle and then Microsoft and then got interested and really drove the creation of and then the global proliferation thereof of social venture partners. Lest you think that he's just like all up here, I wanted to share two other tidbits of information about Paul. One is that he is a referee for high school basketball. And this bit I really love, he has said this more than once, that he got married too young, but to the right woman, so it's all worked out. And if you want more on how that all comes together, the data, the transparency, the impact, the marriage, and all that, I encourage you to see his TED Talk, which is rather fabulous. That brings us to Jane Meseck. So Jane heads up Microsoft Citizenship's Tech for Good. She's breathless with anticipation because they actually don't know what I'm going to say about them.
I'm afraid.
Oh, just you wait. Okay, so Tech for Good, Philanthropy, and Microsoft Citizenship. I think of Jane as a very athletic do-gooder with a very strong geek streak. Here are her credentials for that, which is she was voted in high school most athletic, and she was on the women's ultimate frisbee team that took international combat how many times?
A couple.
Yeah, just whatever, a couple. Like, that's the entire world. They're better than all of them. So that's her athletic side. But she also, let it be noted, was one of the only person in her class, now we're backing up to the 80s here, who used a TRS-80. Does anyone know what that is? Can we have a round of applause for the TRS-80?
Come on.
Yeah, Jane Meseck used it to code a walking stick figure crossing the screen. The only one in her class to complete that, right? Okay, and she did also teach quantitative analysis at the, that's like statistics, most of us just say stats, but it's quantitative analysis, at the University of Washington's Evans School of Public Affairs. So she got her start, she has been with Microsoft for more than 15 years now. She got her start in philanthropy when she was 10, and she raised $15.37 for a local animal shelter, which she felt pretty good about until last summer when her son, at the tender age of 8, outperformed her by raising $200 for the local organization Wellspring.
Yes, he did.
Yes.
Kicked my butt.
Let's round of applause for Jane Meseck. So this brings us to Eric Stowe. So Eric is the founder and currently the director of Splash, where they clean water for kids all around the world. If you want a little insight into just how far Splash is pushing this idea of data transparency and impact, I would encourage you to take a little sneak peek. He'll, I hope, share about this throughout the course of the hour, of provingit.org. Just take a look-see around there, provingit.org. So he has many accolades. We could really spend the entire hour just going over their accolades, all four of these. But, you know, like Pop Tech, Social Innovator, Fellow, Puget Sound Business Journal, 40 Under 40, this list goes on and on and on. But he did not take, as is often the case, a completely linear trajectory towards where we see him sitting up here today. He did take some time off, a decent chunk I hear, in between high school and college, during which he played in punk bands, so worked on sort of his musical repertoire, and then also built up his repertoire of tattoos. So there's that.
Direct correlation.
But then he also worked directly with the family of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to research for the later years of life. By way of a degree in Chinese studies, he then ended up working for an adoption agency. It was while he was working there full-time that he got a bee in his bonnet to actually decided it was unacceptable that so many kids had unclean water. He started what was then a Child's Right, which has now become Splash. So that's Eric Stowe. And then we come to Beth. I'm going to go, can we just, I mean, you know you just want to go, whoo. Just go ahead, get it out. Yay. Yay. So Beth's presence in Seattle is the catalyst for this conversation. I'm going to go on a limb and say everybody here and who's joining us online knows and loves Beth. So we know that she is a prolific blogger, author of the network nonprofit, and now, little show and tell, Measuring the Networked Nonprofit. For those of you who have not seen it, yes, it's an excellent book. So she has a knack for sharing really useful information, right? She's generous in the way that she shares that. One of the ways that she shares that is through training. Can I see a show of hands how many people have been in a training with Beth? It's amazing. What most of us don't know is how she got her start. She knows the story I'm about to tell. So Beth's dad is an OBGYN. You kind of know where this is going, don't you? Training OBGYN dad. So now we have Amy Lang's Birds and Bees and Kids.com, so she has the Birds and Bees with Eats scripts for parents. But Beth's dad didn't have that and gave her a very detailed account of how babies are made, which Beth then took. She took notes. She went down to the corner with her easel and her colored pens, for which she is now famous, and she proceeded to teach all the neighbor kids how babies are made. And thus was launched her career as a trainer. Imagine the delight of all the neighbor kids' parents. So we have Beth's dad to thank for that. Can I have a round of applause for all four of them, please? Okay, so Eric liked that story. So we are going to spend the next hour answering the questions that came to us via the moderator and Twitter and a few other sources, looking at some trends that are going on. And then at about 4:30, we're going to transition to live Q&A. So part of the reason I wanted to take time to introduce you to each of these panelists is so that you really had a sense of both the depth and the breadth and the resource that you have in front of you. Paul needs to exit stage left, literally, at 4:30. The rest of them will be staying. All right, so we'll be sort of answering the questions, and I want to give a shout out to the co-curators who took the time to figure out how to take all those different questions and give them some themes, which was Peter Drury. He's at Seattle Drury. He's the development director at Splash. Yay! Yay! Zan McCulloch-Lucier, who's now with Food Lifeline at Zanorama. And a special shout out to Shannon Doolittle, who was in the back of the room. SL Doolittle, yeah. There she is. She helped us on the question. She also is the reason that, like, we're here, we're sitting in things and everything. She's really the brains and the brawn behind the operation, so that's Shannon. So it seemed like we were going to have a conversation about data and transparency and impact, that it was important to define impact, because it means a lot of things to a lot of different people. So I'm a word nerd, so I busted out my dictionary, my Old English dictionary, and the second definition I just want to say, but was a market effect or influence. So I was curious, and Paul, if we can start with you, of when you think about impact, how do you define it?
Sure. So I think there are sort of two levels to it. At one level, it's really not that hard, which is, so we work with kids' education environmental organizations. And when we think about, for example, kids' organizations, we're trying to work with organizations that are measuring attitudinal, behavioral, academic, familial changes in that kid's life, right? And for example, we work with powerful schools, and they can measure kindergarten readiness. They can measure proficiency in third grade reading. They can measure kids' motivations to succeed in school. And most groups that we work with, when we fund capacity building, they can build a theory of change to say, what's their impact? So I think actually defining impact in one level is not that hard. It's a very intentional thing that an organization can do. At another level, it's incredibly hard, because if you get around to then what is the end game of that data that I've collected, what's the attribution around that data, what's the quality of the data that goes into measuring impact, how do I integrate that data for a kid or for a community, how do I create access to that data, how do I create meaning out of that data and that impact, it gets incredibly complex and it gets incredibly hard.
That's your answer, it's hard. Is measuring impact just about proving it, or is it about improving it?
Right. So when we invested and fund it, you would say for a funder it's for proving it, but at the end of the game, the greatest value should be about improving it, right? Any reason any organization has data should be to inform its practice and its service and its product and improve it. So that would be the idea. It's a management tool. It's a feedback tool for the organization, which, by the way, also can hopefully communicate its impact to the external world.
Eric is someone with a website called provingit.org. I was just curious if you just wanted to,
That's awesome. I think we get confused between mission statements, vision statements, and what an actual outcome is. I think we spend a lot of time talking about inputs and outputs. For our organization, we could easily just say to you, we have served in our lifespan as an organization 500,000 kids. That could pass as our outcome. It's not. It truly isn't. It's how many kids today are served water. I heard someone at your talk this morning behind me mention that Tom's Shoes, they were going into a new country and they were going to serve 1 million kids. I don't give a shit. It's how many kids have shoes now. How many of those shoes failed? How have they supported local economies? How have they employed new enterprises? How are they actually scaling? But more importantly, it's how many kids today have clean water for us. How many kids for Tom's have new shoes that are protecting them day in, day out. And so I think we just get lost in this inputs versus outcomes, and outcomes is far more important. And they're really, I think they're dynamically tough for most organizations to articulate. Like right now, any donor of any organization, including mine, can you tell me what our outcome measurements are, what our impact model is? You can probably tell me what my vision statement and mission statements are, but I think most people would be really hard-pressed to say what our actual long-term outcomes are. Yeah.
That's one of the things that makes this work so hard, right? I came out of the private sector, I'm sure many of you did, and earnings per share is a beautiful, beautiful thing, right? It's one thing, it's one number, I know how to measure it, that's the end game. And the work that we all do does not have one end game. I need outcomes. I'm with you on that totally. And even when I got the outcomes, right, how do I put that together? How do I draw a picture with it? How do I know what the end game it's really added up to? How do I know how good the data is that got me to that outcome, et cetera? So I'm with you on outcomes, and then the complexity comes in. How do I add those outcomes together to add up to something for my organization's work?
That you pivot off of and course correct.
Yep. Yep.
from the funder's perspective, then what happens when you're investing across many different missions, and how you aggregate impact across those different missions is hard. So if you're investing from puppies to kitties to kids, how do you think about impact and aggregate that up to say what you're doing in the space and how you're funding and how you're having an impact in the community? That's also, then you're having to think about qualitative impact and how you're bringing in those stories and aggregating stories as opposed to data.
So follow up in the spirit of easier said than done. Bill Gates, a few weeks ago, put out his 2013 annual letter, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and the whole theme of it was measuring progress. So he says in there, you can achieve amazing progress if you set a clear goal and find a measure to drive progress toward that goal. Which sounds great, and then you start trying to do it. So, you know, one of the things that came out loud and clear from the questions that we got in advance was a sense of like deer in headlights, wow, okay, I want to, but that feels overwhelming. So and Beth, I'm hoping you'll lead us off on this. What advice would you give to organizations who want to be data informed, as you say, not just data driven, but data informed? How do they know what the quote unquote right data is for them to be gathering and looking at?
That's a great question, and it's one that I spent a year thinking about with my co-author.
Did we mention Beth has a book?
But there, you know, we have these 7 simple steps of measurement. And the first step is really defining success. And for a lot of organizations, that's kind of easy because it relates back to the mission. So what are these overall big results? What are the changes that we want to see? As you know, that's the easy part, as Paul was talking about. And then we're going through and figuring how much time is it going, are we investing in this? And then what is our measurable goal? What is that that metric that we're going to track? That's the hard part, especially how it gets translated from different points of view in the organization. But the way to make it easy is instead of calling it a key performance indicator, call it a KBI, and that's a kicking butt indicator, since we're talking about butts. So what is it? What is it that? Well, okay. What is it? What would have to happen? Have this conversation with your team. Lock them up in a room. Get a whiteboard and ask, what will we see to make us say, wow, we're really kicked butt? To have your board of directors call you in and said, okay, everybody, open the champagne, take a month off because you have done a fantastic job. And also, on the other hand, to ask the question, wow, we're really getting our butt kicked. What would that failure look like? And then you kind of bring it down to what are those 1 or 2 data points that are going to tell us that we've achieved that we need to take the measure along the way. And what happens is, I think, is that a lot of it, that's hard to do. That's the hard part. And it takes patience, it takes a little bit of discipline, and it's much more easy to talk about the data tool and all these other metrics that we're collecting, and we kind of get distracted. But I would challenge people to really, sit with that conversation, not just once, but over several sessions, and don't do anything else until you have that defined.
Do any of you have examples of organizations that have kick butt indicators and are using them regularly?
It's an evolving field.
Well, I just gave you one, Powerful Schools, right? I think that they have a set of, you can point to lots of organizations, I think, really that do a pretty decent job of it. We worked with Home Builder several years ago, and they have very specific outcomes. If you go look at David Hawkins' work at UW, they've looked at organizations that have incredibly deep data test and control on youth violence prevention, et cetera, right? So there are great organizations out there. He put them into communitiesthatcare.net. There, I think, are actually a lot of organizations out there that do a pretty good job with it. There's still many more to go, but I think there's a lot of organizations that do a good job. Per your conversation, what Beth just said, what I also think is really important is no matter how hard it is, and kind of per Mr. Gates' letter, no matter how hard it is, no matter how kind of hard it is to get to the outcome, you still got to try, then we'll get to can we fund it, but you still got to try to measure what you can measure, right? You have got to, the fact that it's hard or it's difficult to get the data is not a reason to say, therefore, I'm not going to try to measure it. You got to try to measure. It may not be perfect, it may not be the end game, but you can't say, because it's hard, I can't measure.
And that's,
I was just going to say, absolutely. I think how dare any of us give money to someone who can't prove that they're doing any social good? And if you can't define and measure impact, how in fact are you raising money? Sorry, I mean that literally. I mean, if someone can't define what they're doing socially, the change that's happening in the society from their direct intervention.
And I was going to say
maybe a 501c3.
that, yeah, measurement can be hard. I mean, I'm not a natural measurer. In fact, the first line in the book is, I used to think measurement was the equivalent of Darth Vader chasing after me with a radioactive lightsaber. I mean, I didn't know my way about Excel. I'm not a math girl, and I know as I've gone out and talked about this, I know that there were a lot of people in nonprofits, they didn't start to do this work because they love spreadsheets, with all due respect to Microsoft. They didn't, they're a passion for social change. But we need more, social change people with passion for spreadsheets. And so the point is that you can start to do measurement, and you can start very simply. And in fact, that would be the advice, to start with these smaller pilots. Don't try to measure every single goal. Don't try to collect every metric. And try something that, if you're first starting, try an easy win. There's nothing wrong with that, to get in the habit and the skill set of measurement.
I think Start Easy is a good one. Vitana, you guys familiar with Vitana? I was having coffee with them recently, and they were talking about, it can measure the impact of giving this kid a scholarship and the increase in their wage. It's very easy to measure, they can do it. But the ripple effect around that you spoke of, how do you measure the impact then on their family? That his younger sisters now get to go to school because he's earning, and their family now has a roof because he's earning a higher wage. And how do you measure that? But start with that thing that's really solid and concrete, and then figure out how to go the ripple around it.
So then, because what I heard you saying, Eric, and I don't know if they turned off his mic before he said they should take away their 501c3 status if they can't prove social good. But how do you, right? So the farther up the logic model food chain you go, the more expensive and the tougher it is to get those metrics. And so, and then what I'm hearing Beth say is, and Jane say, try something small and be able to prove it. And then you're going to get into sort of anecdotal, this is the impact on one family. So would that be good enough?
I guess using our organization as an example, so we have 3 primary long-term outcomes. It's better health and development for the kids we serve, local ownership, and theft. We really want people to steal our model, plagiarize it, make it better, and kick our butts in the process of doing it. Local ownership, you're talking about supply chains, distributions, service economies, building out the local organizations to take this on past us. And better health and development, you're using proxies like clean water that lasts, hygiene that lasts, sanitation that lasts, an increase of those populations that are actually using this. So you can use immediate term M&E kind of metrics to act as proxy indicators towards those long-term outcomes, and none of those are hard. Again, 3, better health and development, that's a really hard one on the surface from right here. I mean, that's a multi-year kind of goal. But you can take these little incremental pieces in months or even sometimes single-digit weeks and figure out if you're going towards those goals. I think it's doable.
Your use of the word proxy is interesting because I think nonprofits have a hard time using the idea of a proxy in their data collection. They want it to be specific and hard, where in fact, you might need to use a proxy to get that impact.
They're long term. You can't see them now. Right. And we're trying to look around corners effectively, and the only way we can do that is to use those proxies.
Yeah. So that's...
I totally thought you were going to bust out with dummy variable.
Dummy variable.
Really? That's where I thought you were going.
Heteroscedasticity.
Well, I was going to say, don't measure the ocean. If you can, if you don't have the capacity and the resources to measure the ocean, maybe you measure one beach. Mm-hmm.
Beth, will you share your crawl, walk, run, fly? It's really handy.
And it's very funny because I actually first shared it here 2 years ago at the Washington Tech for Good conference, and it was inspired by many years of doing capacity building and technology for nonprofits, and a Martin Luther King quote, which is, if you can't fly, then run. If you can't run, then walk. If you can't run, then crawl. But you got to keep moving forward. And so, many years ago, when I started doing technology, I would make all nonprofits try to fly right away, and they'd all fall down. And so I've been working very hard to look at what are the incremental baby steps that we can start with at crawling, and what does that look like in terms of measurement. So I have a maturity of practice model for network nonprofits with about 15 different areas of practice. And it goes from culture, capacity, listening, engagement, content. And it's a rubric, basically. So if you're doing a content strategy and you're at the crawl level, what does that look like? And what do you need to get to the walking level? So should I get more
Is that
specific?
in a spreadsheet?
It's actually, not only is it in a spreadsheet, but I have now taken
Are there
it.
pivot tables, Beth?
Yes, there are. Those pivot tables changed my life. But I've been talking about this, and I use it as a, I've been using it in workshops, but now I've taken the instrument and I'm in the process of validating measures. So an organization can take this assessment and come up with scores in each of the areas. And I've been also using it as a benchmarking tool. Then right now I have about a group of 200 World Health nonprofits. Their social media people are benchmarking all their organizations so they can come up with, wow, our average score for engagement tactics is a 2.5. And so if my individual score is a 3, then I'm doing well. And let's look at all the 3s and look at what their best practices are.
So the benchmarking allows individual organizations to peg themselves to a cohort?
Right, and to compare themselves, because measurement is a comparative art. And also, it helps you uncover best practices, and it also helps you define where you may want to bolster some weaknesses.
Do you have an anecdotal story of an organization that has started crawling and is now flying? Or just crawl to walk, or walk to?
Oh, well, I have one of a crawl to walk, and it's with social media and measurement. So, because that's a lot of where my work is. It is a arts organization that's in San Francisco, and they serve Asian artists in the community, and they have 2 people on staff. They have a director and an assistant director, and both of them do everything, including cleaning the bathrooms. I don't know if that's familiar to some of you in the audience.
Sound familiar?
Yes, okay.
Washroom washers?
So they were first like, we don't have time to measure, we don't have time to do this. And then they decided, okay, we're gonna get over our denial and we're gonna start to measure, because if we measure it, our social media effectiveness will know where to spend our time, and we'll make better decisions. So they started very simply. They chose one channel, Facebook in this sense, and they set their objectives were to increase awareness, to get more people into exhibitions, and to increase engagement. And so they just started tracking their content according to how many more people are aware of it, how many people are engaging with us, are those comments on topic related to our exhibitions. And then they also started surveying people who were coming up to their shows, how did you hear about us? Did you hear about us, on Facebook first? And so this gave them kind of a framework to, practice with baby steps on a measurement cycle around their content. So now they're actually ready to apply this to other channels and to other ways of working.
Anything else come to mind on that? Okay. So we've talked about impact. We talked about data and how that relates to impact. So now I want to introduce this idea of transparency, right? So sometimes when you're data informed and you're gathering data, you get bad news. Right? It's not all unicorns and rainbows. So it's hard enough when you get bad news when you're in the privacy of your office or your whatever. But transparency sort of implies that you would fail out loud, right? That you would do that very publicly. And so I'm wondering, and Eric, I'm hoping you'll start us off on this since Splash has been doing this, but sort of what's the value proposition, or what do you say to organizations to motivate them to start really not just gathering the data, which would be great, but then being very transparent about it?
I'd start with the word failure. And man, it's such a harsh word, isn't it? It's like every organization obviously fails. We're continually evolving, but there's this just natural gravitation towards that word lately. In terms of transparency, so we started this external system called Proving It. It's been about 1.5 years now. And it was initially started up internally because we're a bunch of program dudes, right? We needed to assure donors here that in fact charitable work was happening internationally. And so we'd have our international staff putting in project logs, updates, all our M&Es, standardized surveys into this system. And at one point during the development, we decided to just make it completely open externally to general public, as well as defining when a donor gives to us, we attribute that donor's name or that organization or multiple users full access. So right now, the way the system works, when we get what would be considered a fail log, when something stops functioning, when we have a service call, when someone says your water tastes terrible, that goes directly to the donor at the same time it comes to me. We've basically said we don't want any firewalls in the system, and the primary rationale behind that was we really want to treat donors not as ATMs, but as investors. And I think the only way you fundamentally see trending over time, the ebb and flow of how international development works, is if you allow donors to see this process over time. If I'm going to raise money for a 10-year grant, damn sure they should be able to see it for 10 years. And I think if you take a momentary snapshot, right, the day of inauguration when kids are happy and the water's flowing, that's false advertising, right? That snapshot shows you just one moment in time, but if you actually speed that up, kind of like a frame of film, you can start to see these things where they're not functioning. They're functioning really well, they're terrible. We have a lot of those moments, and in international development, you have to be prepared for that. So what we decided was just to take out any of the firewall from the system and allow all the internal reports coming internationally to headquarters open to everybody, and attributing donors directly.
That decision?
My frustration with NGOs in general. I've given a lot of money in the past, I mean, a lot for what I could afford, and I could never ascertain that these projects had any kind of long-term efficacy or traction. I know that the day of inauguration, whatever it was, a new school opening, kids with shoes, kids with water, you could see that, and they're beautiful, they're photogenic, they're great, but they're just wall art if they're not working for the long term. So it was a flipping of the switch internally from program staff being really upset.
Did you just do it, or did you talk to your funder about it first?
We did not.
You did not what?
We did, sorry. Both. No.
A or B, Eric, A or B.
We did not talk to donors about it.
Okay.
Now, there was one particular donor a little upset because we were showing publicly a couple systems and projects that had failed, and on their own site, they were talking about grants made to us with those same names of sites. But honestly, the conversation has been really, really positive external of that one instance.
Okay. Did that guy take off, or did he stick around?
Actually, the donations have increased.
Good. Cool. Good.
Took a while to have that conversation, though.
Good. So in our case, we fund organizations and we create these long-term relationships, and inherent to it is they've got to tell us what's broken so we can work with them to help them fix it. So different context, but at a sort of a micro level, in our case, we've got to build trust in the relationship. Sometimes we can and sometimes we can't. So somewhere in there, you've established this trust level, right, with your donors, and you're sort of building into your brand. I think people can sort of like trust your brand. And you did it from the get-go, which I think also was great, right? And you had a couple of funders that said this is okay. I think it's, so you're an exception rather than the rule. Good for you. I think this is one of these places where funders are also going to have to lead on this by, number one, explaining their own failures and saying, therefore, it's okay to talk about our failures. Number
Say what?
Yeah.
Did you see Jane twitching next to you?
And giving them, in a sense, sort of the air cover to say that it's okay. And then sort of the moment of truth is, like, that's why I asked you about, you know, your funders stick around. You said that they upped their contribution, which is awesome. The moment of truth is sort of when they say it's broken, something's wrong, does the funder stick around? And there are a ton of disincentives to talking about failure. There's just no doubt about it, right? That's the reality. And there are some funders that will run away when you say you failed. So this is really, really hard, tricky stuff. And I think for the most part, funders have to create the air cover, they have to lead first, and they have to stick around when they hear the failure.
I just think it's so much riskier if we actually don't talk about it openly and right up front. The water sector as a whole, if you envision the water sector of those groups trying to alleviate or end water poverty globally, we've got 3 decades of traction behind us and an abysmal track record. And a lot of that stuff is just coming out now, and it's totally dissuading donors from investing in us as a sector in general. So I think being out ahead of it and actually talking about the places that are really complex, the brick walls, the speed bumps, the hurdles early on, I just think it's huge for us as a sector. So
have you had a moment where you had a failure and you hesitated?
No, not yet. I'm sure I will. It's going to.
I'm trying to get it.
It's going to kick us in the face at some point. So provingit.org, if you go on, the first thing you see is the sites that are not functioning. Our whole goal is to get those back online, remediated, but some we just can't do. But the very first thing you see is our success rate, and those are systems that are operational, kids that are drinking water that day. Okay. So.
Do you have any thoughts on how to reconcile that?
What I was saying? I guess my best answer was, and it isn't a perfect one, is that I think this is one of these cases where I said the funders have the investors, the funders sort of have to lead and create the environment and create the trust to be able to enable nonprofits to do that more. Because we know this, right? In the for-profit sector, it's almost like it's a badge of courage, right? I failed, right? Fail fast, all this kind of stuff, right? And it's just harder and harder it's harder for a nonprofit to do that. So The funders have to sort of like, reveal themselves and their failures. They have got to say that it's okay to do it. And when they see the failure, they've got to, I know there are times when we work with organizations, and I'm not saying we're perfect at this, but they will sort of like walk up to the edge of the cliff and then say, here's what's broken, and sort of like wait and see what you do, right? And are you going to stick around or will you bail out? So I think at a macro level, funders have got to be able to let them walk to the edge of that cliff and sort of say, we failed, and then not walk away.
So is this educating institutional funders or individual donors?
Yes and yes.
I think
So how do we do that?
There's a high level of risk aversion in the sector, both from nonprofits and the funders. And I think you and I are examples of funders that are less risk averse. I mean, we do more with social enterprises, and we expect an entrepreneurial spirit of trying and failing and all of that. But I do think that there's a risk aversion in the sector that you have to also pound through to get to some of this. This guy's not risk averse. So.
His brazen embracement of failure.
You're unique. You are.
And that's
He's also
flying,
young and he's
that's
still
a
got
flying,
his hair, so.
You're flying with failure, but you're flying with failure, but maybe crawling.
My wife would love that quote.
But crawling and walking maybe is about having something in your internal culture, which of course is a leadership issue, where it's okay to make a mistake. It's okay to let it go. I think about Moms Rising, and they have a process internally called the joyful funeral, because they know they're working with new technologies. They know it's not always going to go right. So anybody on staff can call a joyful funeral on a technique. And they even make a joke out of it, saying, should we order the flowers? And it's time, and when they're burying the body, they talk about, what were the lessons learned?
So cool.
And they do this is even cooler, is they do this with their Metrics Monday meeting. They as a staff, sit down and review their digital metrics every Monday morning for a half hour. And they look specifically for things that don't work. And the mindset is about, well, if we are not taking some small risks, then we're not going to get to those big breakthroughs. So we have to make it okay. I mean, other organizations do things like internal fail fests. Do something.
How does that differ, the fail fest from the joyful funeral?
Oh, well, the fail fest.
Just tactically speaking.
Well, tactically, the way it works is that you need to buy a pink boa.
Okay.
And then the first
Write
time,
that down, Paul.
right,
Buy a pink boa.
Right. And the first time you do it, your executive director has to do it, and everybody comes, and it's just the group, and you bring something up from your data and something that didn't work. And it's not just, oh, I failed and I feel bad, but okay, so what did we learn from it? It's like an after-action review. Global Giving does the Biggest Loser contest. What's a campaign that we really blew, and what did we learn from it?
You want to do the failure back?
Well, I mean, think about, in the spirit of being here in Seattle, I heard, and my colleague Nancy White is in the audience, actually, has heard him live probably, Matt Smith, right. So he's this fantastic, maybe she'll tweet the URL, I saw this TEDx talk, and it was talking about the failure bell. So, I mean, just think for a moment, a mistake that you've made, either at work or personally. Think about it for a moment. And then think about what your body's doing. You're cringing, right? So he talks about, your body's going like this, like Gumby. And the idea is that if that's the way you think, don't make a mistake, don't make a mistake, of course you're not going to want to admit failure. But what's a way to let it go? And he came up with something called the failure bell. And it comes from gymnasts. When they make a mistake, they raise their hands, and they smile like a submissive dog and say, I failed. Now it's time to move on. Yay. So what's a really good exercise is to have everybody here do it. So should we lead them through it?
Yes.
Okay, so, all right. So this is great. It's very cathartic. Okay, so stand up.
This is good.
It's good.
We're live streaming it too.
Hopefully I'm doing this correctly. Okay, so raise your hands and say, I failed. Okay, now grin like a submissive dog.
I don't know what that looks like.
And say, okay, I can move on and learn. Okay, we're going to do it again now with a lot of feeling, because I heard a lot of tentativeness, okay? And you have to hear it so the people on the East Coast can hear you, okay? Okay, so raise your hands and scream, I failed! Grin like a submissive dog and say, okay, I can go on and learn.
That's a great picture, too.
Did you get the picture, Jane? I think
Yeah.
there's a
It's
couple
going out.
others taken.
It's going out.
I just picture like someone in our office just randomly standing up, I failed!
I'm pretty sure there's a direct and positive correlation between the level of failure and the submissive grin when a gymnast does it. Like the worse it was, they're like, it was awesome! Just something I personally noted. Maybe it's just me. All right, so we touched on this a little bit, but I want to go back to this question of, so let's assume that organizations, they eye on the prize, they know what their goals are, they're collecting the data, they're sharing it transparently, a la Splash, and I think where the rubber meets the road oftentimes is that it does come back to money. And so one of the things that has come up, and Mr. Gates mentioned it in his letter, which was one of the reasons that he sees failure, is that we don't, or the organizations don't invest enough in doing it accurately. And then there's the new study from the Center for Effective Philanthropy that sort of speaks to that chasm between the organization's desires in this realm and the funder's willingness to fund that. And also Idealware and N10 had that interesting study. And to a certain extent, the Center for Effective Philanthropy validates those findings, and then there's some similarities and differences. So I did give Jane warning that I asked her permission to put her on the hot seat for this one, but obviously it's going to be a big burning question, which is, and then Paul's going to go next. And this is, it's resource, it is funding, but it is also expertise. I mean, I don't think Beth is alone in not loving the spreadsheet initially.
Oh,
Learning, I know you do now, but not everyone has fallen in love yet. So, expertise, resources, funding, can we look forward, do you think, and I'm not asking you to speak on behalf of Microsoft in official capacity, just from where you sit, are you seeing, can we look forward to more investment in this work?
I think my 16 years and one day at Microsoft, primarily funding capacity building. This is the question that just gets regurgitated in different forms.
Well, I wanted to contribute to that regurgitation,
yes,
so I'm glad I asked the question.
Whether that's, how do I fund my technology, because so many funders, how do I fund social media capacity now? How do I fund this data capacity? So it's this question around capacity that keeps coming up. And the first answer is always, well, you need to build it into your programming. So when you're talking with your funders, it's a part of doing business, and it's a part of that programming. If you want to show success of your programming, of your mission, you have to be able to measure it, and it has to be a part of that program funding. We fund a lot of general operating, and I believe you do as well. Yep. So we try to give that flexibility of building that in. But I think at the end of the day, it is a cost of doing business. That, and you have to think of it in two angles too. You have to think of the geeks probably that can generate that data, and the program people that can then make sense of it, whether they're telling that story and informing your programs. And that's part of the equation that I think I'm seeing some nonprofits, they're getting the geeks to generate the data, but then they're not investing in the capacity of the program people to actually understand it and move it forward. So I think the funding question is an issue because it's a general capacity building question, and how you work with funders, and a part of that is how you develop that relationship, how do you build those programs, how you define that and fund that, but then thinking broadly about your capacity and making it a part of cost of doing business. It's important. I'm not sure, Paul, if you have an opinion on that.
You said it well. We give unrestricted funding. We actually don't tell them to do measurement or not do measurement, but inevitably in a 5-year relationship it's going to come up. Mm-hmm. So we're hoping that they will come to that conclusion themselves, but you've gotta give them the flexibility, you've gotta give them the capacity to be able to measure, right? And a lot of people, I would say as much individual as institutional philanthropists don't get that.
Yeah. Well, that was my follow-up, is the institutional, individual, and what advice would you have for organizations in terms of educating individual donors so that we're maybe slightly less obsessed with the pie chart?
What advice would I give? I just sort of said it, right? If you want to know what the impact you're giving is, you've got to give these people the ability to tell you. Got to invest in it. I mean, it's not complicated, right? It's sort of almost become nonsensical. I don't know why, particularly people that come out of the private sector that go into philanthropy or go into institutional funding, I don't know why they don't get this, right? I mean, they couldn't have run their own businesses without the ability to measure their impact. They have to for the SEC or whatever, right? So therefore, a nonprofit's got to be able to do the same thing. So sometimes it doesn't make sense to me why you don't enable and give the capacity and give the funding for a nonprofit to do it.
Yeah, no, and I think Paul and I both play a role in the community, in the funding community, to beat that drum with our fellow peers that you have to fund capacity, and that's just not something that is heard very well.
I think capacity needs a rebrand.
Right.
We do.
Or else you need to think about it. If you're doing like a social media campaign, why wouldn't you allocate 10% of your time or resources to measuring it so you were making, getting better results and making better decisions? Yep. I mean, it just makes good sense. I mean, and then there's, so that's at a base level, and of course there are, additional costs when you may get to the point where you need to bring in an expert to help you, do measurement, or you may need to invest in some systems or training.
I would just say the onus is not solely on the funders, though. I think you hit it perfectly. If we're not treating the measurement of our programs kind of in equal importance to our CFO, right? That position is integral for us to actually know we're having any kind of social good. And I don't even think it's just success. It's to know where we're off mark, right? That we can appropriately course correct towards our long-term outcomes. But if we're not measuring, that's really on us. Essentially, we need to approach you for funding, or the donor community. But ultimately,
the royal you.
You, definitely you. But I think as a sector, we don't see those positions as holding the level of importance that they actually do.
Position? You mean actual position?
Actual measurement within our office, not just bringing in a consultant to do spot checks and kind of stress tests on what we're measuring, but actually having those people integral into our, maybe it's a programmatic person, I'm not sure, but they're as important as a CFO would be for a normal organization, if in fact we want to have that long runway.
Okay. Anything? I want to make sure that we have plenty of time for the Q&A. I also gave them warning about this because it's a little bit tricky, and you'll see why. Our final question is, if you had 140 characters or less, I'm just going to pause there for a moment while you reference your notes. If you had 140 characters or less, what advice would you give organizations or individuals who want to change the world and make it a better place?
Oh, geez.
Yeah. I was in the email, Jane.
Can I give any, can I have context or anything like that? Or just, okay, all right.
As it relates possibly to data transparency and or impact.
So
but I don't want you to feel hemmed in. By your 140 characters.
I'm on my Twitter right now.
No, so I'll go. So if Gates says they don't have enough money, then who will own positive change for our communities? We all have to.
You're looking at me to go next?
Yeah.
All right. I'm inspired by the failure talk, but I think funders and nonprofits should enter the whole data thing into partnership, and we should fail together on it. It shouldn't be just the nonprofits fail. I think the funders should fail as well, and I think that's the way we approach it. More than 140.
That was 168.
Easily. I put it in a bit.ly.
Eric?
Can I have an option A and an option B?
No.
Only one. All right. Yeah.
Beth just said that's 2 tweets.
And it sounds like I'm railing against the NGO world, and I'm not. That's where my heart lies. But if someone says I'll start right now. If someone says it's too hard to measure, don't fund them.
If I could learn to love measurement, you can too.
All right, so I believe it is right around 4:30. Can someone validate that that's true? Oh,
yes.
Okay, so I want to pause. We are now going to transition into live Q&A from you guys, so I hope that you have your questions ready. Before we do that, can we get a great big round of applause for this panel? And in particular for the always entertaining and informative Paul Shoemaker, because he does have to exit stage left because he has another commitment. Yeah, he's got to go referee a game, so thank you, Paul.
Thank you.
All right, Shannon Doolittle.
Hey everybody. Does anyone have a question for Paul? He's got 5 minutes, so I'm going to make him stay.
I'll follow up with you.
Anyone, you get something special if you have a question for Paul. Anyone. He's a funder. He's a good guy. Come on. Oh, here we go. Over here. Okay, Paul.
Yeah, Nancy.
Hi, Paul.
Hi.
So I want to know how, and from you and from everyone else, how we engage the people we're engaging with in this data transparency and impact, because the conversation so far has felt really like what we should do as funders. I mean, what about the children drinking water, or the shoes, or the people in the classrooms? How do they own this? Because if only the organizations own it, I think we're losing big time.
I'm going to let Eric start.
Eric.
He's run away.
Oh, no, he's in the back. I'm sorry, he's in the back. Okay.
How do you get those kids involved, Eric?
I was making sure my car didn't get a ticket. Sorry.
So I know he can wax eloquent, but so I'll at least get started, and then he can top me. So I think it's a great point. I think that this conversation, we get sort of like caught up on our shorts between the funders and the NGOs, right? Which is valid, and yet what we do lose track of is the end game of this, right? Which is, you know, people on the ground, people in communities, and what the hell do they think about this? And there is definitely some movement in this world around constituent feedback, and I think it could be really powerful. And go.
He's got.
It's all yours, dude.
I didn't hear the question, but I love the term constituent feedback.
Just go.
The fact that Charity Navigator is slowly migrating in that way. So our Proving It platform, as it stands presently, we're trying to build that into a 2.0 platform where it's appropriate, adoptable, and applicable to anyone in any sector. So global public health, environment, human rights. And it has 3 core tenets. So the first is that you actually can show your impact model to funders, to general public. Second is that you can show your tracking towards that or against it. Maybe you fail, that's fine, but that you're tracking over time and you're allowing everybody to see that. And third, that you're truing that up with real user reviews, so constituent feedback. Because I can, any day of the week, I can show you my 990, my annual report, my website, and they look great. Then I can show you Proving It in general, what we're tracking. They probably look pretty great. But what happens when someone in that community says, this water tastes like shit? Right? This system, great that you've shown it on here, that you started a project 9 years ago, you haven't visited in 6 years. How do you deal with that incongruence? So a big portion of Proving It 2.0 is absorbing real user reviews without really high frequency to try and true up the data. So.
I like that. The constituents feedback, but also the constituents impact reporting is an interesting notion as well. So through our Youth Spark programming and our Give for Youth program with Global Giving, we're focused on donations for youth that get the skills and resources they need to get a job, start a venture, get further education. But yet, once the kids get the funding and they do their training program and they start their business, they're often gone from that nonprofit or that environment. How do they report back their success or failure through that? And how does that be okay? So we've been working with Global Giving on how do we keep track of those youth, or how do we want them to keep track? And how do we want them to come back and report back the impact that this program has had on them? And that's kind of one of the interesting things we're trying to solve for, and using the tools and technologies that those youth like. So how do we get them to report back with SMS or a quick video of what they're doing or how it's impacted their lives, and how do you capture that? And so there's some really interesting things you can start thinking about tracking impact of the actual beneficiaries of programs and coming back in.
Awesome. I think it's the whole next wave.
Yeah,
I mean, I really do. If you're not listening to, nobody we serve, they don't, of course they're not voiceless, right, but they don't have the conduits to express their voice. And if we're not listening to them, we're not listening to the people we purport to serve. So.
I know from the crawl, walk, run, fly assessment, that, you know, I gave an example of how it's being used now, but the development of that instrument was completely participatory. Along the way, the questions were open-ended, and I was getting a lot of feedback. And then once I was able to make the categories, then tested it out again with participants saying, does this accurately describe the stage? How would you change this? And a lot of iteration. So involving them, the participants, in the formation of the measures.
Is anybody in the audience doing anything along these lines you want to share with the group? Engaging stakeholders in the creation, and then, no? I just thought I'd check, because you're all out there, and possibly there might be someone.
So if you're one of those people that just epic fail when it comes to asking questions, just do it. We're embracing it, so I want you to think about it, okay? This is the perfect Valentine's Day gift, by the way.
You can measure your
yes,
love.
You can measure love. And I did learn something today about Beth that I think is phenomenal, and it just shows you what an epic do-gooder she is. But all the royalties from her book go to funding an amazing young girl in Cambodia to go to college. So, woohoo to Miss Beth. Okay, next question, and then I'm coming over to you.
Hi, my name's Nathaniel James. I'm starting a new group called Philanthro Geek. So I'm going for the geekiest question, if you're ready for it. So I've been getting really interested in the reporting commitment at the Foundation Center and the H-Grant Open Data Micro format. Sorry if I left anybody behind. I've been saying that the mistake in the naming there is like if the founder of Coca-Cola called his product Brown Drink. I think there's a lot to get excited about in that initiative, and I think maybe one or all three of you could help me make that case. So, or also pitfalls with it too.
I didn't understand what was the question?
Epic fail. My part.
Might you be able to rephrase the question for our panelists?
Yeah, sure. Well, rephrase it. Are you tracking it? Are you excited about it? Are you nervous about it? And it's really off the radar for so many people. So I'm looking for really great ways to make the case for leveraging the data that's now pouring into an open database, but it's not being used, right? Software is not being developed to translate it into visualizations, translate it into cross-tabulating it with World Health Organization data.
Is it that 990 data stuff?
No, it's 15 points of metadata that's actually produced by foundations when they're doing intake and output. And it was just announced last year. It's an initiative at Foundation Center, and the 15 largest private foundations just signed up for it like in November. But it wasn't like a big announcement or anything like that. However,
apparently not.
Yeah, right. So, but the thing is, so now, like I was asking someone, I mean, wouldn't you love to get under the hood of those organizations? And they're making it available now. The data's there, but the tools and the interfaces and the use cases aren't defined. I mean, the data's piling up right now, but it's just not being used. So, sorry if that was way ahead of the curve, but it's,
Consider yourself schooled.
Yeah.
There. Yeah. What do you think?
I think you actually bring up a really good point, because I hear a lot about big data, and I think big data, big data, big data, and it's like the sexy new thing, but big deal. Unless you have those tools and techniques and examples of how do you apply this? How do you can use this for better decision making? Tell us some stories, because I know for myself, I don't know what I don't know, and I need an example. Mm-hmm. And also, not only do I need an example, but I want the chance to talk about it with peers, and collaborative sense making. So it's not just the data.
Is IHME on that at all? I mean, they're local. They've got 15 billion data points they're pulling from. They've got over 160 either full-time students or staff. They're out of UW. They're based Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation. That's all they do all day long. So they'll put like an economist to focus on agricultural data. They'll put an agriculturist to focus on global public health data. Do you want to find out if they're looking at it? Yeah, I'd be happy to. I'd be happy. But that's literally all they do day in, day out, try and make sense of big data pools that otherwise were used for different things. I have no idea how to answer that question outside of that.
I think a lot of big data issues are, big data are great for people that can ask big questions sometimes, but for the everyday nonprofit, big data, not necessarily relevant unless they really got a whole grip of their own small data and how you can mash it up in sensible ways and concrete ways. But I don't know, I mean, I taught that quantitative analysis class, and I still don't like big data. It still scares me.
Any other before we go to the next question?
I would just say some of the questions that came in online, I think we, and I think I represent somewhat of the NGO world, we treat data like it's the panacea, right? We're going to absorb it, and by extension, we're going to know what to do with it. And data is just a tool, right? Big data is just a much bigger tool with a cooler visage. Yeah, I'll stress all day long, impact model. That's really where you want to target your focus. But man, there's just this massive push towards data as that kind of golden, sunken treasure.
Why do you think that is?
I don't know. Maybe a total absence of data in general to inform.
It's easier to look at this as, oh wow, this will solve our problem.
It's
we don't, we'll just push a button.
Yeah.
Oh, this new software will solve our problem.
It's like all I need is a website. All I need is social media.
Right.
All I need is data.
All I need is a Facebook page, as opposed to facing because it is hard work, as we said before, to come up. It doesn't have to be hard work if you get started with small steps, but the act of sense making and applying it.
You got a question queued up, Erica?
I do.
I'd love to follow up. My name's Mead Thayer. I'm with the Pacific Northwest Association of Independent Schools, so private schools, K through 12. I want to follow up on the sort of developmental stages piece, because I think where our industry struggles the most is we have an acronym that we call TWATI.
Wow.
You guys are
That's
all
the way we've
scary
always done it.
Brown water and Tatwati.
TWATI. That's the way you've always. That's the way we've always done it.
Oh, that's the way.
That's the way we've always done it.
Okay. Yeah. So the question. So I want to go back to your developmental stage piece or incremental steps. Is that we talk about the need to do it, but I think a lot of nonprofits are struggling with just how to take even that first step. And if there's some helpful hints there, I mean, is it just culture within the office? I'd love to get some insights on just that first initial step.
Can I, just really quick before I go in there, we're working on a project with N10, and they've actually pulled together a cohort of nonprofits, thinkers about data and how to think about moving nonprofits along this data continuum, the crawl, walk, run. And so that's one of the conversations that's just now happening is how do you scope out a pathway and the metrics around the pathway? What are the policies you have to have in place? What are those, so I think some of the stuff N10 is thinking about is this exact question that, there's just not that defined pathway, those examples for folks to follow. Maybe you're somebody to follow.
But chapter 2 in the book.
But chapter 2 in the book.
No, it's the pilot project. To develop the book, I worked with 60 grantees at Packard, and we did action learning projects around the 7 steps of measurement. And the task was to find, your first project should be an easy win. Again, don't try to measure something really complicated. Maybe it's a campaign. Maybe, it's a communications campaign. It's a small program. It's something that isn't insignificant in the organization. It's something that people care about. And then it's not trying to measure everything in that program. It's maybe just measuring one objective. And maybe then it's not measuring that one objective with 25 data points. Maybe it's just saying, we're going to measure 2 data points at first, because these are the ones that we found that are really important. And we're going to go through a cycle of doing that for 2 or 3 months, that we're going to collect it, we're going to look at it, we're going to think about what does this mean? How can we improve what we're doing based on the patterns we're seeing in this data? And then once that system is in place, then it's building on that. Okay, what's the next thing we're going to measure? Or are we going to go deeper in measuring this one campaign and collect 2 or 3 more data points? And it's by that, repeating that process, that it becomes part of the culture.
We like the discipline of, you can only ask 3 questions. What are those 3 questions you're going to ask? And only ask 3 questions. And that's hard for folks to do, but yet it really gets down to the nuts and bolts of the data point you're trying to get to.
And also give the questions and imagine what is the data that will answer this question, and then say, so what, 3 times. So what? So what? And don't be afraid not to collect something. We have this thing, we have these really fat, bloated spreadsheets because we have all this just-in-case data. Get rid of just-in-case data. Just in case I might need this, it might tell me something.
So can I give you an example of a joyful funeral that you've just enabled me?
Make it quick, Mead.
Okay.
Which is, as an accrediting body, it was to assess the impact of your school on the success of a child. A reasonable piece, but how do you measure it? How do you take that big, large topic and boil it down to a piece that's going to be really useful? And the small step, I think we've just been overwhelmed by the scope of that project.
Right.
We don't know how to begin.
Yeah,
That is scary.
So I have our next question.
You got to stand when you do it, Ron. Sorry. Come on, do it.
We failed!
So I'm curious how you all measure, or how you think about measuring collaboration among organizations, and also measuring kind of the larger impact that a whole sector is having, so that our measurement doesn't get too siloed into our particular organizations and measuring their impact.
I love that question.
Collaboration, that's good.
I'll take the first swing at it. We occupy someone called us a boutique firm once because we focus specifically on institutionalized kids, and I think it's totally appropriate. We have a niche focus, and I think it's really ultimately kind of myopic, and it serves us really well. But the only way we're going to get 100% coverage in the communities we serve is by collaboration with the folks who would otherwise be considered our competition, so other water sector groups. I think we're kind of an anomaly because we work with orphanages, with schools, with pediatric hospitals, so we're already working with children-centric organizations, and we just kind of absorb ourselves into their day-to-day kind of machination and then exit and monitor and service over the long term. But in terms of the water sector as a whole, we have to work with larger groups, significantly larger groups with much bigger donor pools than ours. And I think a few years ago that would have been considered anathema for where we're at, because really we're so siloed, we're so territorial about our donors, but there's a big movement now in the water sector that we have to work as a team collectively and essentially unbrand if we're actually going to reach 100% coverage of the target population.
So how do you actually have KBIs for, like within your collaborations?
No, we remain siloed in as much as our partners say, okay, you take the schools and the hospitals, we're going to take the community centers. And so we kind of still focus on our long-term outcomes, those top three.
I'm trying to think of some concrete. I love the collaboration question because we do a lot of collaborations, both with bringing together other funders and nonprofits, and a lot of intermediaries. When you add intermediaries into the mix, I think KBIs even become even harder to think through. But even at a collaboration, you still have to think through what's the mission of that collaboration, what are the objectives of that collaboration, what is success, and what are those three questions there. So I still think the methodology applies, but I do think it's harder because you're bringing together some different interests and some different missions that things get mushier, but I think collaborations are super fun and can be really effective.
I was wondering why are you measuring collaboration? Is that not a strategy? Is that an outcome? Is collaboration an outcome, or is it an activity?
Is it the end, or is it the means to the end?
Yeah. Is it a means to your end, or the end?
The end.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, means to an end. I work with an organization that serves youth, and collaboration is a way to reach more youth and reach them better.
So it's sounding like it was reminding me of one of the peer capacity building programs that I'm working on at Packard is to provide social media and measurement capacity building. And so we actually had a cascading theory of change. And so what the big outcome was about, they were all children's healthcare advocates. So that the ultimate outcome was that children in these states, get healthcare insurance. In order for that to happen, policies have to change. In order for policies to change, there has to be better relationships with legislators and aligned partners. In order for that to happen, there has to be a solid and improved communication plan that leads to better relationships. In order for that to happen, there has to be a solid integrated strategy for social media, and there has to be measurement discipline in it. In order for that to happen, there has to be, capacity building and training and this peer group that's working together and trading best practices. So maybe what you need to do is just sort of lay out, what's called a theory of change. What is the cascading set of outcomes and transformations that need to happen, and then thinking about what those key metrics are that let you know that you're making them each step of the way. So where do align partners with better collaboration, where does that fall within this whole kind of longer term results?
International sign for longer term results.
Yeah,
did anyone think Beth was going to fall out of the chair at some point? She kept going and going. Next question.
I think earlier you were someone was asking, does anyone have an example of engaging your audience? And I kind of shyly raised my hand. My name is Sarah Schott. I'm from Knowledge is Power. I'm currently on leave writing a book on open government. But before I left, will you stand up, please?
Look, she's fixed her posture.
International sign for will you please stand? Thank you.
Because we'll be able to hear you better.
But before I left, we had a pilot project, which we received a $7,500 grant for, tiny grant. And we did a civic engagement project where we did civic engagement trainings for citizens on the legislative process. Most people don't know how to effectively engage.
And so we had a curriculum that we had created and a training, and we asked actually 5 questions on a intake survey and an outtake survey. So when they got there, we asked them 5 questions. When they were about to leave, we asked them 5 questions, and one of them was, would you recommend this training to a friend? Which we thought, would kind of help us see if it was worth their time, if they got something from it. And then we tried to match that up with more anecdotal information post-training, because it's so hard to track if somebody decides to take action on a legislative. But what we found really great data from those 5 questions, but having such a small grant, what we had to do to process through all those hundreds was we actually scanned the forms, and between work-study students, who are graduate students, and virtual personal assistants, we got all of those entered into Google Docs and got, sorry, I just got itchy. And so we found stats like 94% would recommend the training to a friend, which was exciting to find out. I guess my follow-up question for you is, in an area where it's sometimes challenging for nonprofits to even get the funding that their program is worth. I mean, $7,500.
I know, you overachieved for $7,500.
Yeah, close to 1,000 people trained in Seattle, thank you. And yet, what are the phrases, what are the ways that we should be approaching foundations to say, we need funding to do metrics? And then, like Eric said about, if your nonprofit can't give you metrics, don't fund them. Should a nonprofit walk away from a funder because they won't help with funding metric gathering?
Yeah, I mean, I think that goes back to how partnerships are developed and whether you want to actually partner with that funder, and that's a part of the partnership development. And the nonprofit could walk away. Absolutely, they should. If it goes against what, if they won't fund, but they're asking for a lot, then there is an issue, and you might want to walk away. You don't want to be funded at all by someone that does that. So I don't know. One of my issues is like, wow, someone gave you a tiny grant. They shouldn't have expected any kind of reporting back, quite honestly. I mean, it has to be commensurate with the level of grant. But I do think that's part of the discussion in developing a grant is, this is the objective we're trying to achieve. We're going to measure it in this way, and it's the cost. It's the grant. This is what the grant is. It's not an add-on. It should be built in within the narrative of the grant that this is what we're trying to achieve, and data collection and data reporting is a part of that. So that's my opinion.
My work at Packard, I'm actually a grantee, and I have to say they are really fantastic about. They don't just say, "Here's the grant and go do it."
Really good. They have great practices.
I did kind of a midterm report, and the questions were things like, what's happened that surprised you, or that you didn't anticipate, or, did anything go wrong? And it was okay, and how would you fix it in the midterm report? So it wasn't just like, here's the money, go do it, and we expect these unrealistic outcomes at the end, and expecting a massive amount of your time to generate all this data to prove that you did all these unrealistic outcomes. It was, here's the project, these are the regional expectations, here's the, the measurement plan, and let's check in along the way, because there's going to be, especially if you're doing something edgy or experimental, or and it's not a huge, gigantic grant. It's something, it's for learning. So I just think that's really important. I know that's not always
we did that with our Imagine Cup grant social entrepreneurs. They are shocked that we gave them this grant, and all we asked them is like 3 questions, just checking in. And part of the wanting to check in and what's going, not so good, in terms of how we phrase that, is it enables us to help them turn the ship in a way, or provide additional resources, whether it's connections or whatever, in a way that we want them to say it's okay that things are not going well, and making that 3-question check-in as easy as possible and as accessible as possible is important.
And then that follow-up question, if this is, how would you, okay, now that you know this, how would you apply this now to designing the project, the next reiteration, so you get better results?
Right.
All right,
just real quick,
2 more questions.
That question. I'm going to just jump in real quick.
Okay.
I think there's this funding pendulum or continuum where the more sophisticated the donor is, they usually are attracted and gravitate towards the more sophisticated NGO, whereas the opposite is true as well. So the less sophisticated donor group, they don't understand the need for overhead costs, the need that we actually need those unrestricted funds if we want to evolve. And so groups like ours, we're still completely unknown, really, really small. We have 12 domestic staff. We can't just walk into Dell. We can't just walk into Cisco. We absolutely can't just walk into Gates and say, you want to fund us, and this is why. We just don't have that brand capital, social capital. But the more sophisticated, the longer, the more evolved we are in our life cycle stage, we could approach them. And so it's this weird kind of cycle that's really, really uncomfortable for us.
Next question.
There you are.
My name is Eric Sanders. I work with Humanities Washington here in Seattle. I've got a very broad question. I'm curious the panel's thoughts on the best way to use and to aggregate and to extrapolate to the full population of those we serve anecdotal evidence. There's much in our evaluations that, because I double as our CFO, so I love to quantify everything. And there's many things that justifiably we are able to quantify, and it just rounds up beautifully. But some of the best stuff we get is anecdotal evidence. And on a one-off basis, I love to report those out to funders, but I struggle with. I would love to be able to take that because we get anecdotal evidence from all of our evaluations and our constituents, but I just am not quite sure the best way to do that. Everything from like data recognition software to just best practices, because I've got hunches, but I'm like, I just don't know if this is right. I'm just kind of curious your general thoughts on anecdotal evidence. It's some of the best stuff you get.
Don't all go at once.
It's a fantastic question.
Actually, I'll say something that'll get me into trouble. And it wasn't me who said this. That question was asked at another gathering with funders, and there was a nonprofit there, and he said, with conviction, saying, I think that question is just a way that funders ask for that just to say no. Have you actually proven that you've changed the world? As a way to say, no, I'm not going to fund you.
But that's why I suggest buffering up the data, the hard data that you can get with real user reviews. And I think I can tell you right now, 5,000 children died today from waterborne illnesses. That's a depressing statistic. But if I tell you one story of one little girl and what that water has done to her and her family and all the echo effects from there, I'm going to pull you into this story. So I think it's absolutely crucial that you're absorbing that anecdotal information, but you have to buttress that up with the hard data, which you seem to be well versed in.
The stories are gold. I mean, we love those stories. They're actually really hard and can even be more expensive to collect. Yeah, I mean, we love those stories, and we love to figure out how to tell those stories. I mean, again, we go back to our technology funding, and we fund, I think just our software donation program, we donate to 70,000 organizations a year, all different kind of missions. There's no way you can figure out the impact of that, but getting a story of how technology created social change with one organization, our folks just love it and eat it up. So yeah, you have to collect both. You have to do both, especially in areas that are hard to measure.
Data without the story doesn't have context, and then, the story without the data doesn't feel valid.
It's like saying that you're sailing in a boat and you can say how fast you're sailing, how many knots, how fast is the wind blowing, how fast are you going, but that doesn't tell you what it's like to actually experience the ocean.
You have to humanize it.
You have to humanize it. So what is even though it may not be statistically projectable to every single person in your program?
So this is going to be our last question, and another shout out to Microsoft. So you all see this book, which is fabulous. Microsoft did give us a number to give away today. So don't mob us at the end. However, just think about it. If there's a few of you here from the same nonprofit, just maybe one per nonprofit. But we do have these, and I don't want to leave the live stream people out. So the first 5 to tweet, "This panel rocks," hashtag Kanter SEA, I'm going to mail one to you. So last question.
So my question / comment kind of comes from the fundraiser's chair, because there's a lot of folks talking about walking away from funding. And for those of us who are professional fundraisers, we sweat bullets when we hear those things, right? No. So my first thought is on that, but I will say that in my career, what I've seen is I have often seen greater requests from somebody granting $5,000 than from those granting $100,000. And I have been amazed at how excellent the conversation is with folks funding at higher levels. And when I learned to walk away from $2,500 and $5,000 grants, which, believe me, makes me sound nervous just to say it in this room, but I learned to walk away from them because my time was better spent building relations and relationships and communications with foundations and businesses and individuals who might get engaged with our mission, that was a huge evolution in my career. So I want to just give a huge shout out on that for fundraising professionals. My second is on the anecdotal data. I would remind everybody that when we talk about data, I think everybody goes to quantitative in their mind. And I would tell you there's qualitative and there's quantitative data. And when you have quantitative data, like multiple choice answers, A, B, C, D, you can never extrapolate or you can never infer qualitative data. But when you get qualitative data, you can extrapolate and infer quantitative. I'll give you an example. Take people impacted by Humanities Washington, or take alumni of a school or of a program, whatever. Let's say you survey all the alumni and you say, I'm testing these hypotheses, right? You want to say, well, we hear students say they get better jobs after graduation, or we hear kids like the water, it tastes better, whatever. You could wind up saying, you know, of 100 kids who graduated from this community college, 80 told us the following kinds of stories. Boom, 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 boom. And 20 said this. And you can quantify from qualitative data if you've asked it in the right way. So I just sync those ones up a little bit.
That was a comment.
Okay.
Good call. Good call.
It was an awesome comment.
That was
Let's
an awesome
end
comment
on
from
one more
Mr.
question.
Peter Drury.
One more question.
Technicality.
We get a lot of great data, and I think, Eric, you might be able to speak to this most directly.
Will you put that closer to your mouth? So
Like this?
Thank you.
All right. So I just what are some tips or ideas for how to tell a story with data? How to take that data, maybe hard numbers, and make it visually appealing or tell a story and really appeal to either a donor or maybe your members of your organization. And so how do you use data to make a narrative? And do you have any tips
How do you make your data sing? Eric, that seems like a great question for you.
We're still struggling with that and trying to figure it out. And honestly, we just the law of averages, if we have this really compelling story, we need to chew that up with the data that we have. But we usually hear the story first. We're not calling it out of all these data sets. We're really struggling with that. How do we tell our story in such an easy, palatable, visceral way when in fact we're hardcore technical geeks? I mean, to be quite honest, in the office, so we're kind of going against our nature to be able to do that. But we're learning, and we're still struggling with it, so we're trying to figure it out.
You know, one of the things I always do, and this is, you know, when I'm looking at, there's always graphs and charts, you know, not just to generate charts and graphs, but, you know, if you're using analytics programs, you're going to see it visually. So I always look and say, okay, so where are the mountains? You know, is there a Devil's Tower here? Is there a high rocky mountain? Are they little bumpy hills? Is there a mountain where there's someone sliding down a sled? And where are the valleys? And where are the, you know, the flat lines? And then I want to know what's behind those. And then I even play with things like I'll look through and I'll look at comments and I'll make, you know, what are the themes that are here? And are they good themes? Are they bad themes? I even color code them. And then that's where I look for where the story is. Another way is, and then once I've synthesized it, I just go back to some just basic good storytelling frameworks, like, you know, hero, something bad happens, they find a solution. And can I make that, you know, can I find that story in this data? And I put on Mozart in my iPod, or I listen to music while I'm doing it, and I make sure that because it requires this kind of reflective kind of shift from opposed to, like, I got to get things done. It's like a different kind of mind shift. So I make the time for that. It could be 20 minutes, 15 minutes, and that kind of reflective time, and that's when the stories come out. They don't come out when I'm just like looking at it and I'm like this. So you have to like give it some time.
But you're saying they're trued up kind of thematically. They're not the outlier exceptions.
Right.
If you're interested in that, have you read Lisa Simpson for Nonprofits or Homer Simpson for Nonprofits, the ebooks? I'm not making this up. They're actually excellent, based on lots of data and science, and then they go into how you specifically take data and tell a good story. Homer Simpson for Nonprofits and Lisa Simpson for Nonprofits. It's Katja Andreessen, Mark Rovner, and I'm forgetting her name, but Sea Change Strategies.
That's great. I love one slide today you use clip
and
art.
Network for Good.
Yes. There's clip art demonstrating, showing
All right,
visually
and
data.
on the clip art note, this seems like a good time to wrap it up. So can we please thank again the panelists at Microsoft for making this all possible. Beth will be around. They will all stick around, but we're going to wrap it up. Can we wave to all the people who have been joining us? Bye, everybody. Thank you for coming.